In 1979, guitar legend Ritchie Blackmore shocked the rock world by transforming Rainbow from a mystical hard rock outfit into a chart-topping commercial powerhouse. This is the story of Down to Earth, the album that changed everything. First, I'll give you a brief history of the band, then I'll discuss the need for change and why certain band members left the band. I'll talk about the new lineup and the shift in musical direction, leading to a more radio-friendly approach and a hit single. I'll also discuss some of the tracks and how the critics reacted to this new change and how it affected their future. For some history, the band Rainbow was formed back in 1975 by guitarist Ritchie Blackmore, who had just left the band Deep Purple. He started this band by recruiting 4 members of another hard rock band called Elf. This band has a very up-and-coming vocalist who was not very well known at the time. His name was Ronnie James Dio. But these members were all fired after the release of their debut album titled Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow in 1975. All of them except Dio, of course. Then he found some more members who eventually became legends in the music world. They were drummer Cozy Powell, bass player Jimmy Bain, and keyboardist Tony Carey. The band then released 2 more albums, which were considered some of the most influential albums in the development of hard rock and heavy metal. They were Rising from 1976 and Long Live Rock and Roll from 1978. The band had a few lineup changes during this time, but the biggest change was the departure of Ronnie James Dio, who would go on to join another band called Black Sabbath. Now you may be wondering, why did Ronnie James Dio leave the band? Well, basically, Ritchie Blackmore wanted to take the band in a new direction, which was more mainstream and away from the fantasy, sword, and sorcery themes of the first 3 albums. But Ronnie James Dio didn't want to go in that direction. He wanted to go in a heavier, more metal direction. So therefore, it was best that they parted ways. So by 1979, Ritchie Blackmore felt it was time to reinvent the band. As his powerful vocalist Ronnie James Dio was no longer in the band, he had to make some difficult choices, and it was time for an almost completely new lineup. The first person that Ritchie Blackmore approached was Ian Gillan, who was his old band member from Deep Purple, but Ian Gillan didn't go with him, so Ritchie Blackmore held a series of auditions, and he eventually settled with Graham Bonnet, who was a singer and guitarist in a band called The Marbles. They were back in the 60s. As for the rest of the band, only Cozy Powell stayed in the band. Bass player Bob Daisley got fired, and keyboardist David Stone decided to quit. So they found a new keyboardist. His name was Don Airey, who also happens to play keyboards in the current version of Deep Purple, who just released an album. And now they needed a bass player, so they got Roger Glover. So he was not only the bass player, but he was also the producer for the next album, which would be called Down to Earth. This new sound was different than the first 3 Rainbow albums because, as I mentioned before, they were going for more of a radio-friendly approach, but they didn't completely abandon their sound. I'll be talking about the songs in a minute, but there were still elements of some of the more traditional styles in many of the songs. But let's just say they were packaged in a different way. The first single was Since You've Been Gone. It was a cover song. The song was originally written by guitarist Russ Ballard, who previously played in the band Argent, and this was released on Russ Ballard's 1976 album, Winning. But 3 years later, the band Rainbow decided to record a cover of it, and it was on their album Down to Earth. This was a really catchy song. I'm sure you've heard it, and if you don't remember it, I'm sure if you listen to it, you probably will think to yourself, yeah, I know that song. It was a top 10 single in the United Kingdom and reached number 6. Wasn't as popular in the US because it only reached 57, but has been played over the years on classic rock radio and was included on the soundtrack to Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, so it's probably one of their most well-known songs. They had another single called All Night Long. It was their second top 10 hit in the UK, and this one actually peaked at number 5. I guess this was the bigger song, although for me, I think I was more familiar with Since You've Been Gone. But this song was a hard rocker. It received a little bit of criticism because the lyrics were considered sexist, but it still went down in history as one of their biggest songs. The song only reached 110 on the US Billboard 100, but it was more popular in the UK and Ireland. Let's talk about the rest of the album. I think the songs are pretty good. They're kind of a departure from the previous material. The album definitely sounds a little dated. It sounds like the type of music you would hear on the radio in the 70s. I think That's one of the negatives that comes with this album. But on the plus side, Ritchie Blackmore still sounds great. It feels like he's happy with the direction of the band. I guess it's because he took the band in a direction that he wanted, not what the other members wanted. As for Graham Bonnet, this was the only Rainbow album that he was involved in. I think he did a pretty good job on this album, although he probably wasn't the best fit for the band. But afterwards, he would form a heavy metal band called Alcatraz. This album also had a little bit of that traditional sound. For example, the song Eyes of the World had some of that big and epic type of sound, similar to their song Stargazer from the Rising album. This was evidence that Graham Bonnet was able to pull off a song that seemed to have been tailor-made for Ronnie James Dio. There were some other standout songs, such as the track Making Love. Ritchie Blackmore sounds great on this track. The main guitar riff is one of his best. It actually sounds similar to the Deep Purple song Perfect Strangers, which would come out 5 years later, also played by Ritchie Blackmore. Then there was the song Danger Zone, which also had a memorable guitar riff by Ritchie Blackmore. The song is a rocker. It has some of those Middle Eastern riffs that Ritchie Blackmore was known for. It even sounded a little bit like a Deep Purple. Same goes for Lost in Hollywood. It has one of the best drum intros and has great riffs by Ritchie Blackmore. I also like the keyboard interlude on this one. Now, the critics didn't hate the album, but they had a little bit of criticism. For example, AllMusic editor Stephen Thomas Erlewine said that the album might not offer anything unique, but it delivers the goods. His only criticism was Graham Bonnet's vocals, but he also had a few positive things to say. For example, he said that Ritchie Blackmore sounds invigorated on the album. Now, you may be wondering how this album affected the future of the band. The band continued in this more commercial direction on subsequent albums. After this, the band continued down the road of going into more album-oriented rock sound. That they would continue to change members. They got a new vocalist, Jolyn Turner, and they also became more popular in the United States and had a few hit singles on the next few albums. The band had a history of changing members often, so I think that's why they didn't really last much longer after the mid-90s, but that's another story for another video. So if you're interested in some of the events leading up to this album, check out this review I did of Long Live Rock and Roll. I'll stick that right there. Thanks for watching. Please like this video. It helps me with the YouTube algorithm. Please subscribe if you have not already. I do rock and metal reviews, rankings, and more. You can find me on TikTok. I'm on Facebook. If you open the video description, you can find links to all of that, and I will see you in the next one.